Sunday morning. I understand that somebody has said that we're talking about how to do research, but the joy of it is if you're going to do research, it is great to have Sara Mueller on board, that author of the Bone Orchard, a fabulous book that is recommended for all. And
Yes.
that said, I need to turn it. Now, who am I turning it over to this morning, Brenda?
I don't have any idea. I'm hoping my computer is actually doing good things. Phil, do you think you could pick up the ball?
Yeah.
My computer fritzes out, and then if that happens, I'm in big trouble.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
I can
can
do.
too.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. We go way back with Sara. But I'm going to let her introduce herself and concentrate on your research chops.
Okay, well, I'm Sara Mueller. I write primarily dark fantasy and historical fantasy. And my research chops come from the fact that I'm a history nerd and falling down a rabbit hole is great fun. But also, I was trained in archaeology and I did do lots of historical research, both for my degree and for my books. So my research is coming primarily out of having learned it for archaeology, for which it's absolutely crucial, and for, as I say, for history.
Mhm. Okay. And with us also is Joyce Reynolds Ward.
Yeah, when it comes to research, I have a master's degree in special education, which means we are the research nerds of the teaching world. Um, but I also have a certificate in being a legal assistant, which also involves being a legal research nerd, as well as kind of being my, I guess I keep saying it's for a book, but it's actually personal interest. I'm very interested in the history of the Columbia Plateau, which drives a big chunk of what I write. And so there's been some huge groundbreaking stuff coming out because the Native Americans of the Columbia Plateau are speaking out. And I'm living on Nez Perce land right now, and the natives are coming back here, and they are not silent.
Okay. And Brenda Clough.
Hi. I think of myself as a science fiction and fantasy writer, but I sort of took a left turn and wrote 11 or 12 Victorian historicals, and and because the 19th century, whatever else you can say about it, there's a lot of written material. There's newspapers and pictures and books, even some film, if you can believe it. And so you can have such a good time with this that it just can suck your life right up. So I wrote 11 novels very, very fast. I think for a period of time, I was writing 2 of them a year. I look back and it only took me 6 years to write 11 novels. And then after that, I couldn't handle it anymore. And and the other thing was that although they were allegedly historical, gradually the cloven hoof of the fantasy writer began to appear, and the whole thing began to wander off the straight and narrow into the woods. And then I couldn't handle it anymore artistically, so I went and wrote 2 novels set in the 1950s, and that was much more fun. And so a lot of exciting things are developing with those.
Okay. And I'm Phyllis Irene Radford. Most of you know me as Irene Radford.
Mhm.
And I started out as a history major at Lewis and Clark. And I had a taskmaster for my class in historiography, which is basically how do you research and take notes on your research. He just, pounded things like, make sure it's accurate, annotate it, build a bibliography, do footnotes, And so really most of the time I just sort of flitted around with it until I started my Merlin's Descendants series. And then I had to dig in and really research. And you may not think that the first book, which is set in the Arthurian times, around 500 AD, you wouldn't think there's a lot of material there, but there is, and there's more coming out every day. And I just keep thinking, oh, I got to go back and fix this. I got to go back and fix this. But
you can't keep on rewriting those books. It'll drive you crazy.
I know.
And then they'll dig up a parking lot in Britain and there will be some old king and you have to rewrite, and that would be very bad.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that people, I was going to say, I think that's one of the things that people who are doing history research in specific discover quite quickly, and that maybe people who casually take history classes don't really understand, is that our views of history are changing. They always have, they have always been evolving as new information comes forward, as we recognize voices that you were saying about the Native American tribes as voices that we simply didn't listen to broadly in the American public, become more important as we say, oh, look, things depend greatly on your point of view.
I have a big story about some stuff that has come out in the last few years with regard to early settlement, early white settlement in the Pacific Northwest, and the role that Henry Spalding played. Because Marcus and Narcissa Whitman were not viewed necessarily as martyrs until Henry Spalding started drumming it up. But it was part of Henry Spalding's anti-Catholic bias. He blamed the Catholic priests for what happened at Waiapu. And
actually, his wife, Eliza Spalding, is considered a saint by many of the tribes, whereas the Whitmans are just, they are the spawn of the devil.
Well, they were total asses.
All of
they were total, and I mean, but and even going further back,
on a population that has no idea what's going on.
Even going further back, the dominant narrative of the Nez Perce Indian War was dominated by the Army and Oliver Howard and Henry Spalding, until Alvin Giuseppe came to the Wallowas, started poking around, and then he wrote his big book about the about the white settlement of the Northwest, which kicked off some because there's always been some local interest here. And there have always been Native sympathizers here. And one of them wrote a history from the Native perspective. This came out in the mid-70s. And that just started, it's to the point where Rich Wanschneider, who runs the Giuseppe Center Library up in Joseph, says, there's a new book coming out about the Nez Perce every week at one point.
I think there's a comment in the side about history being written by the victors. And I think that's an important note. It's also important to note that history is written by people who have a platform. Yes. And so you run across false narratives continuously in history, and sometimes it's by accident. That's the other thing that has happened a great deal, is you can assume upon a fact because it's so well known. And then when you look at it and you chase it down the rabbit hole, you start looking for any solid evidence, and you end up in the 19th century with some guy who basically made it up. So I had a history professor who said it's important when you research history to remember that people lie. And Victorian historians particularly lie, and they lie a lot. And it's because they didn't know, or they couldn't make sense of it, or they just assumed.
Well, or they were grinding
book out this month.
They were grinding some stupid agenda. You know, the religion is a whole separate thing, which, you know, has been a ball of wax for a long, long time. And or even if it's just the whole slavery issue, you know, it's been a, you know, it's driven like the politics in this country and the history and how it's been recorded for a long, long time. And it is weird to go back and see things like that. You know, you can even see it in fiction. There's so much of the Sherlock Holmes longer works are essentially anti-Mormon polemics. Interesting. Conan Doyle was living in London. Why? How did he get into this? I have no idea. But apparently, you know, you can see it right there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that we can look at things that were popularly reported in their day and then assume that they are true. One of the fascinating ones that hit my radar lately, because I wrote a book in which a lot of women wear corsets, because a corset is basically a bra. And if you have assets of that variety, you need to do something with them. But there was every actress comes on with talking points about, oh, I was in a corset and it was deeply, deeply terrible. And it turns out there are people who still wear them today for various reasons. They wear them perfectly healthily. If you go to Colonial Williamsburg, there are people who have been working in stays there for 15 to 20 years, and so far they're not dead.
It's all a matter of fitting.
One of the things you could assume if you read a Victorian newspaper with big screeds written by doctors about how corsets move your internal organ. I mean, it's a whole thing. But on the other hand, when you do the actual archaeological investigation and you do historical archaeology where you do the thing, you put the clothes on and you wear them, it turns out that if you build it right, it's a functional garment. But the thing is that if you go read those historical sources, right, this is what they say. So it's very tempting to believe your historical source without further investigation. And I think it's that further investigation that it's, yes, and thank you, whoever the user said, a mistake repeated so often, it's taken on the status of a fact. And that is exactly the problem. And that's just an example. There's lots of examples here in history. History's big. But I think that's one of the things that when you do research, you need to kind of be aware of, is that with the greatest goodwill in the world, sometimes with malicious intent, but sometimes really just because historical will be wrong.
I'm addicted to Time Team, where I have seen every episode of 20 years of episodes for, at least 4 times. And they very politely refer to these Victorians as antiquarians. They are not archaeologists. They are not historians. They're antiquarians. And they pound their heads and moan at some of their drawings and maps of what they discovered. And how much, like one corner of a drawing might actually be what they actually saw. And then they build this whole Roman temple out of a cornerstone of a wall. And it's when Time Team goes back in, they find something entirely different. And so that's another thing. And Brenda earlier mentioned something about you find the king's body in the parking lot. That's referring to King John of England. And
Richard. King Richard.
Oh yeah, Richard III.
Right.
But if you read the book about that discovery, and there's a
movie. There's a movie.
Yeah, they made a documentary out of it, but there was also the book before that, which goes into precisely what Richard did as a king, and he was a very effective king. And he had a claim to the throne. Yeah, he may have ordered the death of his nephews. It may have been Buckingham's idea. Why is Buckingham always the villain throughout history?
It's got such a good name. It rolls off the tongue effectively. Buckingham. Like, it's got all the hits in the right places to really sing in prose and poetry.
It's in the water. It's some sort of psychotropic
anyway,
in the water.
Right.
Well, about Richard, they did do in the documentary series that was on the BBC, and I think it was on Nova in the United States. They actually found someone, he actually reported himself, who has the same, within 5%, I think, degree of spinal bend and twist that is nearly identical to the skeleton found in the car park of Richard III, which is fascinating because they basically took this chap out and they taught him how to ride horses and they taught him how to swing the sword off a horse. And they discovered that it turns out plate mail is a very effective back brace. And that jousting saddles are kind of genius for what they do, which is stabilize you on a horse. And all of a sudden they found, it turns out that you could have this degree of spinal abnormality, and I use that in a medical sense, and still have an effectively active soldier's life, which we know because everybody reported it, Richard did have.
Right.
So
he was not.
We all assumed.
Right. He was not a foot
right?
soldier. He did not engage in sword duels. He trained with a sword, but
he trained with a sword, and he did lead troops.
Right.
And he died in battle, which shows you, he was there.
Most of his fighting, all of his fighting, was done from horseback, where he had that brace. And the book also reminds us quite pointedly that Henry VII had no legitimate claim to the throne.
Right. The research. What's interesting is we all historians assumed for years, that because there was this tale in Shakespeare of Richard having a hunchback, and it was assumed that because we could see in history an active life, people argued a lot about whether it was possible to have that degree, right? And the research, when people actually had a reason to go do it, and somebody stepped forward and said, "Oh, hey, that's me. I would help you with this." They leaped on this absolutely nice man and put him through all kinds of stuff. But when the research got done, they discovered, oh no, it is possible for humans to do that. But there's a difference between an assumption. When you look at the degree of lung compression and stuff, doctors could be completely excused for thinking somebody with that degree of physical issue might have trouble. On the other hand, if you trained your whole life to do the thing, you can do pretty amazing stuff. So research there was one of those really formative moments for history when we have to look at it again and say, possibly people with physical abnormalities get demonized in the press. Weird.
And there's that whole thing that the winners write the narrative. Henry had no incentive to make Richard look like a really nice guy. In fact, it was very important to stabilize his own regime, to make Richard look as shitty as humanly possible. And everyone
very fascinating
because he's the king.
And
his descendants were, totally in on this. Grandpa needs to be supported on this. And, Shakespeare was hired by the crown to do good stuff, to do good propaganda. And he stepped right in and did it, because you don't argue with Queen Elizabeth or King James. You just step right up and do it. And he was a good enough writer that we believed him for years. It was very convincing.
It's a very convincing story. And to be fair, I really love that play because it's a marvelous villain. He writes a really good villain, y'all.
Oh, it's wonderful. And it has but at that point, Shakespeare himself is not going to go and dig into the records. He has a living to make. Come on, I have plays to write. You just carry on and go. And so they're the history plays, but they're less and less historical as it goes on. And you just have to accept that. They stand as a work of art. And over here is the real Richard under the parking lot,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And what happened? All of the Richard III bad fairy tales, let's call them. Okay, Henry VII was pushed into the Battle of Bosworth by his mother, who was a fanatic about the Lancasters retaining the crown, even though Henry had no legitimate claim. And he commissioned Sir Thomas More to write the history of that event, making him the good guy, rescuing England from the evil Richard III. And then Shakespeare wrote his play, Richard III, based upon Sir Thomas More's rendition, which was dictated to him by Henry VII. The victor wrote that history.
The victor wrote the history. And I think there's a couple of really good points coming up on the Facebook feed about confusing theater with historical fact, and also about real history being super messy because people just are a mess. But
yeah,
when we read historical fiction, I'm sorry, Joyce.
Oh, well, I think the point that from the Facebook feed that we tend to bend history into a good person versus bad person narrative consistently is
well, and we do structure fiction that way. And I just but when we do research for fiction, the good news is this is where we part company with the facts whenever we want. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're writing about a historical period, it turns out there's a lot of people. The world has a lot of people, and you can't put them all in your book because there are 14 Marys. In just 50 years.
Everyone's named either Henry or Thomas. It's very annoying.
It's very annoying. And so what do writers do with their research? Well, we condense down to try to make it so that you don't get lost in the fact that everybody is Henry, Mary, and Anne and Elizabeth. And there's like 97. If you go to France, the Henrys are fast and thick over there. So we try to bring it down. And that innately makes, to me, historical fiction fun, but inaccurate. And that I feel like if you're writing historical fiction, it should come with a big, this is alternate history on the cover.
I mean, I actually prefer.
And I don't think there's much of a difference, honestly, which is going to really PO a bunch of historical fiction writers. And I apologize to you, but if you have condensed human beings to a single character, you have created an alternate history. And I have Hilary Mantel with my back for this. She has a great talk, if you go look it up, about what happens when you condense characters in history. But it does mean that in writing fiction, if you're doing research, you're going to have to do this at some point.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You see this like, for example, one of my favorite authors right now that I discovered recently is Beverly Jenkins, romance author, Black romance author. And so she writes Black historical romance. There are things she actually will go through and cite her sources at the end of her books, because in part she's wanting to bring up the awareness of the Black diaspora from the South, of the Black towns that were established in the Midwest that mostly have faded, but there are some. And she will actually go back there and say, well, now this town is a conglomerate of several towns, and it's an idealized, because she has a contemporary version where one town she writes about the founding of the town, and then she writes about the contemporary version of it. It's all a series. And so but she goes in and she's very explicit about that condensing and that putting things together in that manner.
Yeah. And how many horse operas have Hollywood made where there are Black cattle drivers?
Very few.
Which Yeah, people of color were incredibly common working ranches and doing that sort of labor because they had done that sort of labor. It turns out there's a lot of cattle ranching in the United States as a whole, but it's something that, again, is not a narrative that we hear, because for people who are not part of that community, in that community, everybody knows about a buffalo soldier. Everybody. But if you're a child in certain parts of the United States, you might not necessarily trip on this fact. And
I have a book on my shelf.
Hollywood movies. Well, and what you see is Hollywood movies. So you see who is cast in the roles.
Right.
Another incredibly common, Asian immigrants to the West Coast. All those things happened. You might not know that there's a giant Basque population in the state of Nevada who are into sheep ranching and casinos, because if you didn't live there, you just didn't know that. And it's not a fault. It's just the world's big.
Well, and the other piece of it, yeah, it's big, it's messy, and there's a lot of stuff that, I have a book on my shelf of when the Indians became cowboys, because one of the issues that happened with the Nimipu in the Wallowa is that they had some very nice big horse and cattle herds. And they lost a big bunch of them when they were forced to leave. Because when it was May, guess what happens in the mountains in May? The snow melts. It snow melts. The rivers run high. They had to cross the Snake River with their herds, and they lost a bunch of them. And they didn't have enough time to round them all up.
Yeah, Brenda, there's a couple of greetings to Mrs. Barnstable.
I'm so sorry. She's down here by my knees raising hell. And so
I think you're allowed to. No, now you have to be subject to the Zoom rule. And the Zoom rule is once the animal enters the scene, you must introduce them.
Oh,
sorry,
this is Mrs. Barnstable, who is a tabby, a brown tabby, and she's rather bossy, but she's overweight, and we're dieting her, and that's why she's very pushy about, you could feed me, this dish is empty, and we tend to be deaf quite a lot of the time. She should lose maybe 2 pounds, which is a lot for a cat.
Yes, and all cats are historians. You can ask them. They remember.
Oh yeah. No, they remember. They go deep into that. The history of that food dish is very, very closely recorded.
Yeah. Okay. Now that we're almost halfway through, Sara and Joyce are both horse people. And I know if I have to have a horse, and since I do write historical, I have to insert horses periodically to get from here to there. These are the two people I called. So horses are not motorcycles with legs.
No, they are not.
Or bicycles.
It's interesting because that's another case where, 100, well, let's go back a little further than that now. 150 years ago, lots of people had experience with horses. They were your primary source of a lot of power. On the other hand, weirdly, if you go back 50 years before that, 200 years back, horses were almost never hitched to plows. It just didn't much happen. It was a cow's job, not a horse's job. But the thing is that the fashion changed and history moved on, but we lose track as we go, right?
And then
there's a lot that we just forget.
Because there's also
horses gone. And so we have to make certain leaps, and sometimes the leaps we make are wrong.
And one of the things
there's the whole mythology around the heirs above the ground being trained for warfare. When you start poking into it,
and one of the other things is that and maybe this is getting back into a research thing. So I give a whole talk it's trying to compress Horses for Writers into about an hour and a half, and it's really fast, and you have to take notes like a demon. But one of the sources that I use, that I hand out at that talk, is I go down to the county extension 4-H office and I get their manuals on horses, and I literally hand them out because it's written in such a way that you can get some basic facts. And weirdly, sources for children, yes, there can be bias, but sources for children will often be an interesting start point for people in research that I have found really useful. Ditto, every historian in the world will tell you that Wikipedia is terrible at history, and it is. Okay. On the other hand, the biographies they list at the bottom are very interesting. Please remember about Victorians. Caveat, go think about the Victorians when you do this. And they're tracing all their sources back to a 19th century professor at Yale. Okay.
Yeah, that's the, and I mean, getting into the horse thing too. There's all this, they were riding draft horses, and the armor was so heavy, and they had to be, yarded up on a horse. They weren't fighting like that. And the horses they were fighting with, if you remember, Henry VIII actually passed a rule, and it's, you talk to people who breed Welsh mountain ponies and Welsh cobs, and boy, will fill your ear with this. But any horse under, I think, what was it, 14
There was
hands,
a minimum, the range was a 14-1 to 15 hands, I think.
Yeah,
was where you allowed to breed the animal.
Yeah, if your horse was too small, you couldn't breed it, and he was trying to breed bigger horses. He was trying to improve the equine stock of Britain.
But Elizabeth came along and realized that those horses are very hard to feed, and repealed that law quite quickly.
Or the absence of mules in a lot of historical fiction.
Right.
Because, Isabella of Castile was pregnant and riding mules around Spain when she was fighting wars. And that was a fairly common thing, was the use of mules. But
there are several classes of things that it's important to research if you're doing historicals, and horses is one of the core ones. The other major one is guns, because if you're going to have people use guns, and if particularly vintage or antique ones, it's worth digging into that just so that you know how they were loading them and how easy they were to fire. They're not all like our modern automatic revolvers.
Right. And your magic word for guns for everybody, and I forget who said this, I wish I could cite them, might have been Steve Barnes. The magic word is modified. That's your magic word.
Right, because then you can get away with murder.
Yeah, we have an interesting question coming up on the sidebar from Kevin Sieber. So how do you examine history to strip back political intent and find the facts and reality of events for your writing?
One of the things that you have to actually remember is that you actually do not care. What the story calls for is the fact you're going to go with, and there's enough of them to back you up. God knows, there's people out there somewhere right now, I will swear, who are writing that the 2020 election was a very different thing, and there's a whole alternate history going on. Someone's writing a novel right now. You want to bet?
Yeah,
no bet.
Yeah,
it is absolutely certain. So you can, and there's a lot of, you are saying there's a lot of people in history, and there's a lot of gaps in history. There's a lot of things where people will just stand back and say, we have no idea what Socrates was doing between this year and that year. There's just no historical record. If you put it in there that he, built himself a boat and sailed to Atlantis, you could do that. No one will be able to stop you.
Yeah, fiction gives you a massive latitude in that degree.
Yeah,
I am because of history, right? And archaeology. I'm a massive fan of first person sources as long as Liam pointed out, you keep the context slightly in mind, right? And you remember that virtually all people are self-interested at some level. Okay, it's unfortunate, but it is true. But first-person sources are very interesting also because they give you such dirt.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Oh, do they ever?
And if you're writing historical fiction, you're writing about people and characters, and the dirt is just delicious. On the other hand, if you want to write an alternate history and you just decide, I am going to go read a bunch of history by Victorian historians, I am not going to examine it, I'm just going to write from the assumption, the vast majority of the English-speaking world is going to believe you. Which is
they believe Shakespeare,
funny and sad all at the same time. But it'll be a fine book because you're writing fiction in the end, right? You're not writing a thesis, you're not writing
a PhD,
a history, you're writing fiction.
Yep. And that gives you fun.
It gives you fun. You're allowed to go have fun, and you're allowed to go play fan fiction with your favorite historical figures. It happens.
Oh, and even if you just stick purely to the things they actually wrote themselves, I have a Victorian household and sex manual that would make the eyeballs spin in your head. It is so great. And you could just draw on that, what they actually apparently were advising on young unmarried women at that moment. Dazzling, just dazzling, I'll tell you.
Oh, there's some amazing stuff. I'm
very sorry. There's a comment here I do need to address about Wikipedia. I'm not turning my nose up at Wikipedia in general. Please, I start a lot of my research at Wikipedia because they do cite their sources for the most part, and they're really, some of them are great, but it is open source. And so inaccuracy does occasionally happen as someone goes, oh no, everybody knows this, right? But Wikipedia is in fact a terrific resource. So please don't think that comment was actually slamming Wikipedia. It's simply a case of it's a really good place to start. Its biographies are super fun. Do keep in mind that the biographies are what people have used, right? Those are the books that they're basing their articles on. And sometimes those books may or may not have bias, or they may or may not. Just chase them a little bit. That's all I'm saying. And for writing fiction, go for it. It might not tell you it will tell you what people really think is true, which is always interesting. So please.
And the good Wikipedia articles.
One comment. Okay, I was just going to say, I know people who, for fun, go into Wikipedia and arbitrarily change things to the absurd. And then they sit and watch to see how long it takes for it to be corrected.
Yeah,
that's
evil.
But that's the problem with open source. It will come back to normal, but how long does it take, and how many people access it?
Did you see that woman in China who essentially created an entire, I think, an alternate history of something? And because it's a relatively obscure bit of China that nobody knows very much about, she was able to do this for a really long time before somebody noticed that there's an entire separate history of a certain region going on that she made up.
Alma Alexander, who's a sometimes guest here, did her Secrets of Jinsei book based on the language that was retained in Chinese harems, the upper class, where women were not allowed to read and write Mandarin or Cantonese, the what was modern at the time. But they retained a proto-form of Mandarin and used it in their secret writings. And once it was deciphered, modern historians are going berserk over it because this is all the court gossip.
There's a woman's history that we do not see.
Yeah, and she based her book, Secrets of the Gensei,
Mhm.
on that one little piece of information, and it's a fabulous book. If you can find it, go get it. But anyway, oh yeah, Liam Westcott just reminded us that the Holocaust is documented historical fact, yet there are people who believe it is fiction. There are also people who believe that men did not land on the moon. They were on a movie set in Texas.
And
There are
there are
people who
people
believe
that
anything.
there are people who believe that we are being controlled by reptilians too. So, you know,
There are people
So
who
just-
could use
yeah.
psychoactive drugs.
I've given up watching the news because people are acting like we're being controlled by reptilians.
Well, but again, I think what we're saying is when you look at sources for history, sorry to bring it back a little bit, when you look at sources, just be aware that there are biases. Be aware that people with zero malicious intent believe what they have been taught.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that they're trying to be terrible. It's that sometimes you get taught things that aren't true. And that's just how it kind of goes, unfortunately. And so just being aware.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well,
Wait,
the other
people aren't real? Yes. No. Maybe, but only in D&D.
the other thing too is that
just be aware of how you approach your research.
right.
That other people have a bias. You have a bias too, and it's going to tempt you, which is also why historical archaeology, where people go try to hitch things to plows, or they try to use this artifact that they have dug up or that we encounter in manuscript, but nobody uses anymore. Those are very important because they give us actual, oh, this works, or wait, what? No, that's not how people's guts are shaped.
Yeah.
But it's what they believed. So just be kind and be aware would be my plea to people doing research. And start with Wikipedia. Great. Carry on
But go
from Wikipedia.
beyond. Go beyond.
But be aware. And or if you start at the library, by the way, reference librarians. I want a moment. Ladies, gentlemen, and others, they're amazing. Please love your reference librarian. They can find you things.
Yeah, they can find you things that are not available to the public.
Outside
I have an example. When I was researching the Guardian of the Vision, the third Merlin's Descendants book, I needed to know who was the Bishop of Paris between these two actual dates. And I went to the Catholic Encyclopedia online. I went to parish priests. I went everywhere I could think of. And that there's like a 5-year gap where there's no Bishop of Paris listed. And I'm going, no, wait a minute. This just does not happen. I called the reference librarian at University of Portland, which is a private Catholic college. I said, anybody can find it. It's these people. And they did. They found one pamphlet in a church library in Los Angeles, actually, that gave me a name. And then just the note that resigned.
Yeah.
Bishops don't resign. They're murdered. They're sent to monasteries in outer Mongolia, but they don't just resign. Well, that gave me wonderful fodder for my book.
I walked into my local, I live in a very small suburb outside of Portland. It's not very big. We have a lovely library. I literally walked up to the desk, and in the days when I went in there very regularly, literally the reference librarians knew me by sight.
Yes.
And I walked in and they'd go, okay, what have we got? And I walked in and I said, so I understand there's an English translation of the diaries of 3 or 4 14th century Venetian nuns. and I need to find it. And they said, awesome. And 2 weeks later, I was holding it in my hands.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
And I don't know where they found it. I don't know how they got it. As far as I'm concerned, they cast a magic summoning with sparkles and lots and lots of library cards from ages past and summoned it out of the ether. But they found it, and it was amazing.
yeah.
And by the way, it was in a bibliography on Wikipedia. So, but it was like,
there's one aspect.
I didn't look for that book. I didn't know it existed. How do you know it exists? You don't.
That is the trick to find out how do you find out that it exists so you can look for it. That's the hard bit.
Yeah, Joyce.
There's another aspect too of history that you can use even in writing contemporary is the tension for your characters is when they find out that the history that they have learned, possibly about their own family, is completely wrong or that it's hidden. And then you really can get into some fun. I do a lot of that.
Yeah. And it's a lot of cases where family histories are created specifically to cover up a serious crime.
Or illegitimacy, adultery. Now that there's DNA analysis, I don't know if anyone keeps up on reading things like Dear Amy and the advice columns, but I can't resist them. And nowadays, when someone writes to Dear Amy and says, I have a half brother. It turns out that my father was sleeping around, but now he's deceased. What do I do? And Amy will now say, you better come out with it because sooner or later, someone in the family is going to do that, 42andMe search or whatever it is, and it'll all come out. And it's never going to be a good day when that happens. Get it out now so you're in control of the narrative a little bit.
I want to, there's an interesting comment again. You guys are asked such good comments and such good questions. Thank you all so much, by the way, in the comments.
Oh yeah.
But fairy tales are an interesting subject in that family histories, I would say, are oral tradition, and oral tradition is not required to be factual, but it is necessary to us as humans.
Right.
Now,
and it's worth mentioning because very often there's a kernel of truth at the base, which the family has expanded on.
Or the family, and when we say serious crimes, sometimes it's simply a family would like to, could we just please not mention this incredibly embarrassing thing, which is, in the lots of families have done that over the years. And it's not done, again, out of malice most of the time. Most of the time, it's just, this is incredibly embarrassing, and I would like to not be involved in it and move on from it. And if you watch a lot of the Finding Your Family, Finding Your Roots, Who Am I think, is the British version of that. It's interesting to watch people's reactions because some of them are incredibly touching, and some of them, people are very upset sometimes.
It's
hard to hear. Sometimes the truth is very hard to hear.
Yes.
And
there's a whole big cover up here. There was for nearly 100 years about the involvement of, at the time, several prominent county families. They're not acceptable scions, were involved in the massacre of Chinese miners in Hell's Canyon.
Yes.
And that was not brought out until like the early 21st century. Now, I have seen references to it in stories. There was they're regionally published and low level before it even came out. Someone was talking about it. So it was known. But dear God, when the reporter from the former Oregonian reporter started tracking it down, going to the county clerk, going to some of these people, there was a conspiracy of silence about it. And it wasn't that the people who did it were prominent. It was that they were related to prominent people that were all tied up. And it's still not clear that we know everything about it.
Well, and it's self-interest, right? There's self-interest lay with not mentioning this terrible thing. And there are countries in the world. Germany has this problem in spades, because of course, I hate to say there were Nazis in Germany, but there were, and there still are. But like, the problem is, there are plenty of families who have histories there that are deeply, deeply problematic, that the people themselves were not involved in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do we have a this isn't the we have a moral obligation to make it right thing, but we do. But the other thing is that it's not malice on their part. But when you do research on this, and you're researching a family history, or you're researching a point of that was in a newspaper in the 1700s, right? They're fascinating, and there's such rich and fertile ground in the silence. Look at the silence.
Absolutely.
And those are places that you get to re-examine, and you get to go dig. And sometimes you find, look, there is one copy of a Paris pamphlet that mentions this dude that nobody knew existed for 5 years. But those are really interesting points in history, and they almost always involve conflict of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, can you get a lot of good material out of those. But be prepped, because you may find yourself very challenged by what you find out. And sometimes you're going to want to back up a bit in your research and decide, okay, I have just found out 16 horrible things before breakfast, and I am going to go take a walk and get over being mad about it. Because that's the other thing, is you will find yourself faced with research that makes you mad. Not even when it's about you. Sometimes you're mad on behalf of people who it's like, they don't know who you are, and they never will. But take the deep breath, try to stay level with your research, pick what you need, because that is what fiction's about. But please try to understand and stay as deep breath, level as you do your research. Try hard. You won't always succeed, but it's one of the crucial bits, is to understand what you're choosing to convey or not.
Yeah. I want to harken back to my historiography class umpteen million years ago. And the advice that we were given was that look at both sides, even if you're looking at original material. You look at the diary of one of Henry VIII's sergeants who's demolishing monasteries for the wealth. Also look at the records of the sister priory that took in the refugees and the stories that the monks are telling. And you get and weigh the two against each other. And then for fiction purposes, pick the story you need to tell. But I wasn't always allowed to, but when I submitted my manuscripts to Daw Books, I had a disclaimer in the front saying this is my interpretation of historical events. And I worked hard to keep the history part of my fantasy accurate and just insert the magic to make it happen the way we remember. And that's kind of, that's an interesting way of being a historian and an author of fiction.
Yeah, so, I mean that's what you have to do.
Yeah.
I mean one of the things, and because I keep looking at writing fantasies that are essentially alternate history of North American colonialism, and I keep more and more these days, again, I keep hearkening back to the way that Native peoples are talking about their history. And I'm reading, I can't remember the title of it now. It's totally gone out of my head. But one of the things I'm reading an ebook right now is a very interesting history portraying the Lakota people as being poised on the brink of establishing an empire that was almost equivalent to the pre-Revolutionary War American colonies because they were powerful. But one of the problems they ran into as they went into the plains is that they had too much protein and not enough carbohydrate. They were dependent on their friends, their clans, their peoples who lived along the rivers, who were growing the corn, who were growing the grain to balance their diets.
Yeah, resource acquisition plays a massive role in history, and that's always a very rich angle for your research. Also, I will say that if you look at what somebody doesn't have that they either want or need, doesn't, like, both of those things happen, but that's a good thread to chase, because there's a lot of really bizarre, like, there's some things like that just didn't know.
Oh yeah.
But there's some really bizarre ones out there, like really weird. There are like wars get waged over things like a color, literally the color of a dye.
Purple.
There's a whole war in Italy that happened.
Yeah. Okay. We're down to less than 5 minutes, people. So it's time for a wind up. Pimp your books, whatever you need to say. One each, minute each. Sarah, and thank you for coming.
My book is called The Bone Orchard. It's a Gothic science fantasy emphasis on the Gothic. It should probably come with some warnings because it deals with very unpleasant people who are doing very unpleasant things. And by very unpleasant, I mean real unpleasant. However, it is not on screen because I wasn't writing that book. So, but it is about a woman who makes alternate personalities into extraneous bodies, and how that doesn't work very well when you're trying to solve a murder mystery. And yes, that is the QR code for my book. It should take you to the page. It's out in hardback, paperback, and audio. And I got to pimp my narrator because she's amazing.
Yay!
Yay! Always pimp the narrator.
Okay. Good. Joyce, what's your latest book?
My latest book is a near future science fiction romance now, and it's an alternative history. It's kind of, I call it a fan fiction of my main Martini Air series, but it's called A Different Life, Now, Always, Forever. And it postulates a future that is not quite The Handmaid's Tale, but it's getting there. And so, yeah, now, always, forever.
Okay. Brenda.
I have a book coming out next month, but it's not out yet, so I'm not sure it's worth telling people about it. But you could always go over to bookviewcafe.com and look for Marian Halcombe, which is the first volume in my Victorian, the 11 Victorian thrillers. And that first one, like all good entry-level drugs, is free. You should think of me as Walter White with that first little hit of crystal meth. If I can't hook you with the first one, you know, you're not destined to become a drug addict.
Okay. I recently received back publishing rights to all of my early books from Daw, 20 of them. And I am working on getting them cleaned up and put out through Bookview Cafe, bookviewcafe.com, all one word. And my very first book, The Glass Dragon, will be re-released from the Bookview Cafe at the end of June. And then I'm hoping to have them one a month, at least through the end of the year. And then I may take a break. But I'm going to be having hip surgery in 10 days. So I'm kind of at a point where things that are hung up, like new covers, might not happen. But anyway, that's what I'm working on. And I am also working on my 50th book, which is kind of a spin-off of the Tess Nonquare adventures. But it's really my homage to science fiction conventions. which are a different reality altogether.
Oh, yes.
So anyway, that's it for the Sunday brunch. And thank you again, Sarah, for coming on. I can always rely on you for costumes and horses and French history and all kinds of strange things.
It was so great to see you all.
Yes. And the comments on the side are amazing. I love all you viewers.
You guys are really great. I wish we could have gotten into the Everett massacre and the Centralia massacre.
Yeah.
Too.
There's a load and local history, man.
We can.
Sorry, I could go on about
Other
history
session
forever,
we can
everybody. And you're awesome. Thank you.
I know it's terrible, but this is where I have to come do the sales pitch. Hey, as you guys may know, we are a slightly left of center small press.
Slightly.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Slightly. You have no idea how many times some of my editors grumble about me being an old white guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell them, whatever. But the deal is our last book that we put out, well, not the last, but one of the last few, is I'd like to change the name of the BQ Press to Prophecy Press.
Oh, ho, ho.
Because this book, Post-Row Alternatives, one of the stories was about how states were going to start restricting immigration for pregnant women.
Mm-hmm. Idaho.
Yeah, Idaho's already trying to do it. This book, and I'm just putting it up here because this is an awareness, guys. These people aren't going to stop trying to take away our rights until we've got them reduced to the level of a fourth tier bunch of nobodies trying to run a party. They're not going away on their own. It's going to take our votes. Just making that note. And since this was about research and BQ Press is about politics, can anybody guess when I'm dealing with defenders of the South in the Civil War who say the Civil War really wasn't about slavery, what my favorite piece of research is to hand them?
The separation documents for South Carolina.
Or Texas or anybody.
Read the Articles of Secession. Just go read them.
Yeah, go read
You won't like it. Go read them.
I grew up in Virginia, and I believed that because it was what we were taught in school until I moved to Oregon. And I got real historians telling me slightly different stories.
Yeah. I mean, you guys talked about source documents. You don't get much more source than the Articles of Secession.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well,
so we're in your I was just going to say, when you're in your political defending or attacking, whatever, it is kind of like what President Biden did when he held up the pamphlet about that they'd put out saying, yeah, we need to do away with Social Security. He had their documents in his hand. Documents are powerful things. Don't be afraid to use them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, we're out of time.
Oh, I know, but I still got a couple more things to tell you.
Okay.
Well, I wanted you guys to go on and have as much fun as you could. But
we did.
It was a really fun discussion.
We are finally closing out our anthology on Madam President, edited by Deborah Godfrey. Okay. So if any of you had a story that you were working on, you got about 2 days to get it in, unless it's you guys. But Deborah Godfrey is editing Madam President for us, and we have just closed the open call. And it will be out in October. And at the same time as you end one, you begin another. Deb sent me last night Alternative Leadership. And that is the stories of the style and access, to the underrepresented in leadership. Okay. It's going to be fun. That's going to open here in a few days. And I would be disappointed if I couldn't find 4 lovely human beings that are going to walk away from this podcast thinking about, wow, I could write a story on underrepresented people in leadership. Yep, just giving you that one. We have the Scott's Planet, 1,300 colonists abandoned on a distant world in a Carboniferous area, Carboniferous period equivalent by evil corporate overlords who are making their way on their own. We are still open for another month. We closed that one May 30th. Now, Phil, and this is a warning, she's going to open in June alternative theologies, more alternative theologies. Okay.
Oh, now that one sounds like me. Remind me, Phil, I will do it.
Okay, yeah, we had alternative theologies a couple of years ago, and it's my favorite of all the anthologies I've edited anywhere. And we had so many really wonderful stories we had to reject because we just didn't have room for them.
I'm too good at this.
And
I will write you a story about the sacred shark.
Okay.
It'll be very nice.
And I did a trilogy on the star gods in my dragon world, and I'm really thinking about writing the three brothers' reaction to being, they're outlaws, they're smugglers, they're space jockeys,
and suddenly
and they're proclaimed the star gods. Now what do they do? They have to live up to it.
And I'm not done because
okay,
you're not done.
The beautiful thing about BQ Press is I'm retired, and I just went back to work long enough to make enough money to finish publishing those anthologies, because you all know anthologies are not how you get rich. But Karen Anderson, better known as KG Anderson, is going to be editing Alternative Truths Southern Edition, bless their hearts. And because with the rise of the Disney wars in Florida, there's about 5 stories all in its own. Just don't get me sued by Disney. And Sarah Huckabee and everything going on in the South. We decided this was the great time to reopen a old box, and that is the Alternative Truths. And basically the consequences of what would happen if these Southern fascists got into power. And so that's the open calls and stuff we've got going on. And we encourage the writers who are listening to write, the writers who are attending to
jump in,
write to finish the story.
Yeah. Because I got to tell you, while I have the rights to an anthology that Brenda is in, we haven't got it put out yet. And Sara and Joyce, I find it one of the sadder things in the existence of humanity is that I haven't had a chance to publish short stories by either of you.
I
have
to tell you, I write very few short stories.
I know. And I did one of them.
Yes, you did.
Yeah, it was in Japan.
But anyway, yes, I just was.
Yes,
and I did one for Joyce in Alien Campfires, Tales from Alien Campfires.
Oh, you've done a number of mine, but
Yeah,
but
that's
I'm
the
not
one
very
that I
sure.
remember. I think it's the best thing that you've written, to tell you the truth, is the one about the Everclear
Well,
in alien campfires.
the
Oh,
best thing who written?
Joyce.
Joyce. Yeah, I've read some of Joyce's stuff. I've been in books with her, and by the way, now that I own the rights to Alien Campfires and we get contracts going, we'll be selecting some of those to go into the
The
Alien.
best of Camp Con.
Yeah. So that said, guys, thanks for coming. Readers, or watchers, thanks for being here, making it, because it's only as good as the comments we receive and the feedback from the writers. And next week, we have Cliff Winnig is going to be here, and we're going to be talking about banned books, book banning, and we're taking it beyond the LGBTQ because, and we're going to get on to the case of those from the right and the left who want to see books banned. It just ain't gonna, we can't let this happen quietly. And so that said, we will see you next week here with Cliff Winnig, and
Bye-bye.
everybody wave goodbye. Anybody have
Bye-bye.
anything you wanted to say?
No.
Nope.
Bye-bye.
Good. Then I'm going to say end it.